The cold that Elias Thorne encountered on the morning of November 12, 1969, as he stepped off the rattling bus at the edge of the Kalinin district, was not the abstraction of temperature that Americans understood when they complained about winter. It was a physical entity, a living adversary that pressed against the exposed skin of his face with the insistence of a hand pushing him backward, away from his destination. The air itself seemed to crystallize in his lungs, each breath drawing in microscopic daggers of ice that scraped the tender tissue of his throat and bronchial passages. His fingers, already numb despite the wool-lined gloves he wore beneath fingerless outer mitts, had lost the capacity for fine motor control within the first 10 minutes of his 2-kilometer walk from the bus stop to the estate. This was Siberian cold transplanted to the outskirts of Moscow. The kind of cold that killed the unprepared and maimed the careless, the cold that would become his constant companion, his torturer, and ultimately his most convincing disguise for the next 12 years of his life. He wore the uniform of invisibility, a sheepskin coat so saturated with machine grease and coal dust that its original tan color had surrendered entirely to a mottled gray-black patina. The kind of garment that marked a man as belonging to the vast underclass of Soviet manual laborers. The coat hung unevenly on his frame, one shoulder sitting higher than the other, a deliberate asymmetry that matched the pronounced limp he had cultivated over 18 months of exhaustive preparation. His left leg dragged slightly with each step, the result of what any casual observer would assume was childhood polio or perhaps a poorly healed industrial accident. The kind of disability that was ubiquitous in a nation where workplace safety was theoretical and medical care for the working class was rudimentary at best. The limp was a masterpiece of tradecraft, achieved not through theatrical exaggeration, but through the careful weakening of specific muscle groups, the strategic placement of a small stone in his boot that forced an authentic redistribution of weight, and the mental discipline to maintain the affectation even when alone. Even when he believed no one was watching, because in the Soviet Union, someone was always watching. His papers identified him as Pavel Ivanovich Volkov, born in 1931 in a village near Perm that had been depopulated during the war. The kind of village whose records were conveniently incomplete, whose surviving residents were scattered across the vastness of the USSR, making verification nearly impossible. The documents were not forgeries in the conventional sense. They were genuine Soviet papers that had been carefully altered by specialists who understood that the Soviet bureaucracy's greatest vulnerability was its own Baroque complexity, the way documents passed through so many hands and offices that the introduction of authentic-looking paperwork into the system was often easier than attempting to create perfect counterfeits from scratch. The KGB had files on hundreds of thousands of citizens, but they did not have unlimited resources to investigate every maintenance worker, every janitor, every dvornik who shuffled through the empire's infrastructure performing the unglamorous labor that kept the machinery of the state functioning. The selection of Elias Thorne for this particular assignment had required 3 years of deliberation within the upper echelons of the CIA's Soviet Directorate. The operation, codenamed FROSTKEEPER, had been conceived in a cramped conference room in West Berlin in 1966, when analysts had identified a potentially catastrophic gap in American intelligence regarding the Soviet Strategic Rocket Force's command structure and nuclear doctrine. General Vitaly Pavlovich Molotov was not a household name in the West, but within the closed world of Soviet military planning, he was a figure of immense significance. A veteran of the Great Patriotic War, who had risen through the ranks to become one of the chief architects of the USSR's intercontinental ballistic missile program. He was a man who hosted other generals, nuclear scientists, and occasionally members of the Politburo's Defense Committee at his dacha in Zavidovo, a forested retreat 90 kilometers northwest of Moscow that served as an informal headquarters for discussions too sensitive for Moscow's bureaucratic corridors. Conversations that took place over cognac and cigarettes in wood-paneled rooms where the walls absorbed secrets. Traditional espionage methodologies had proven ineffective in penetrating Molotov's inner circle. The KGB's second chief directorate maintained aggressive counterintelligence protocols around all senior military figures, making the recruitment of staff members extraordinarily dangerous. Electronic surveillance was marginally useful. The Americans had managed to place listening devices in several Moscow locations, but the Dacha in Zavidovo was swept weekly by technicians with detection equipment, and the forest itself provided natural acoustic isolation. What the analysts needed was not a bug or a recruited source, but a human presence. Someone who could exist in proximity to these conversations without triggering suspicion. Someone so thoroughly beneath notice that the generals would speak freely in his presence the way aristocrats had once discussed treason in front of servants they considered furniture rather than people. The concept of the dvornik was central to the operation's design. In Russian society, the dvornik, the yard keeper, the maintenance worker, the coal shoveler, occupied a social position so low that he achieved a paradoxical form of invisibility. These were men who existed at the periphery of Soviet life, performing essential but degrading labor that kept buildings heated and pipes from freezing, but who were regarded by the educated classes with a mixture of pity and contempt. A dvornik was expected to be simple-minded, often partially disabled, marked by the physical toll of decades of brutal manual labor. He was someone to be ignored, someone whose presence was so naturalized that conversations continued uninterrupted when he entered a room to tend a fire or replace a coal bucket. The brilliance of FROSTKEEPER lay in its inversion of traditional spycraft. Rather than attempting to place an agent in a position of trust or access, it would place an agent in a position of such complete irrelevance that trust became unnecessary. Thorne had been selected from a pool of 37 candidates, all of them officers with specific technical skills that aligned with the mission's requirements. He was 34 years old when the selection was made, a veteran of a previous tour in East Germany where he had operated under commercial cover as a machinery importer. His Russian was native level, acquired during a childhood spent in an émigré community in Brooklyn, where his mother had worked as a translator, and his father had run a small printing shop that catered to the neighborhood's Russian-speaking population. But language alone was insufficient. What distinguished Thorne was a psychological profile that suggested an unusual capacity for patience and isolation. During his evaluation, the agency psychologists had noted his ability to remain motionless for extended periods, a quality they described as active stillness, the capacity to be physically present without demanding attention or interaction. He was also a trained mechanic, a skill he had acquired during 2 years in the Army before joining the agency, and this technical competency was essential because the cover would require him to actually perform the work of a dvornik, to actually maintain boilers and repair pipes and chop wood, because in the Soviet Union, incompetence in one's assigned role was itself a form of suspicious behavior. The training for FROSTKEEPER consumed 18 months of Thorne's life and nearly destroyed him before the operation even began. The agency had established a facility in a remote section of Alaska's interior, a compound that approximated the physical environment and infrastructure of a Soviet rural estate. Here, Thorne lived in a reconstruction of a typical dvornik's quarters, a crude gatehouse attached to a boiler room where temperatures rarely exceeded 50 degrees Fahrenheit and often dropped well below freezing. He worked with authentic Soviet-era heating equipment, massive cast-iron boilers that had been purchased through intermediaries and shipped across the Pacific, monsters of obsolete engineering that required constant attention and possessed temperaments as unpredictable as the men who built them. He learned the specific rituals of maintaining these systems, the precise angle at which coal needed to be fed into the firebox to achieve optimal combustion, the sound a boiler made when scale buildup was restricting water flow, the technique for clearing a frozen pipe without fracturing the metal, the ratios of birch to pine wood that produced the longest burning fires with the least smoke. The physical transformation was as important as the technical skills. Thorne spent hours each day practicing his limp until it became so deeply ingrained in his muscle memory that he occasionally caught himself maintaining it even during his rare periods of privacy. He stopped exercising in any conventional sense. Instead, he performed only the movements that a dvornik would perform, The repetitive motions of chopping wood and shoveling coal and hauling water, allowing his body to adapt to these specific stresses, while other muscle groups atrophied. He lost weight. Not dramatically, but enough to give his face a lean, weathered quality. He stopped shaving carefully, allowing his beard to grow in uneven patches that he trimmed irregularly with dull scissors. He cultivated calluses on his palms that were so thick they became almost nerveless. He learned to suppress his natural intelligence in his facial expressions, to adopt the slightly vacant gaze of a man whose cognitive horizons had been narrowed by decades of repetitive labor and social isolation. The psychological preparation was more subtle, but ultimately more transformative. Thorne was required to spend increasing periods of time in character, first hours, then days, then weeks, when he was not permitted to break role, even when alone. He stopped reading newspapers and books, replacing them with the kind of cheap detective novels and propaganda pamphlets that a barely literate dvornik might struggle through. He listened exclusively to Soviet radio broadcasts, the interminable speeches and martial music that formed the auditory landscape of Soviet life. He adopted the mannerisms he had observed in the Russian working-class men of his childhood, the way they held cigarettes pinched between thumb and forefinger, the way they stood with weight shifted to one hip, the way they ducked their heads slightly when addressing social superiors. He practiced the specific form of debased Russian that was characteristic of the uneducated rural population, dropping word endings and mangling grammar in ways that signaled both his class position and his intellectual limitations. By the time Thorne arrived in Zavidovo in November of 1969, Pavel Volkov had become more than a role. He had become a second self that existed in parallel with Elias Thorne's original identity, a persona so thoroughly inhabited that the psychological boundaries between the two had begun to blur in ways that troubled the case officers who conducted his final briefings in Vienna. They saw in his eyes a certain distance, a quality of remove that suggested he had already begun the process of self-erasure that the mission would require. They approved his deployment anyway, because FROSTKEEPER was too valuable to abandon, and because Elias Thorne was the only asset they had who could credibly become Pavel Volkov for the decade or more that the operation might require. The infiltration itself was a masterpiece of operational opportunism combined with the kind of brutal physical ordeal that left no room for theatrical pretense. Thorne had arrived in the region during the first serious cold snap of the winter, when temperatures had plummeted to 25 degrees below 0 Celsius, and a series of storms had dumped nearly a meter of snow across the forested areas surrounding Moscow. General Molotov's Dacha, like many of the retreats built for the Soviet elite in the 1950s, was a substantial compound that included the main house, several guest cottages, a bathhouse, and various utility buildings, all connected by a system of underground pipes that carried hot water and steam from a central boiler house. The system was temperamental even under optimal conditions. In extreme cold, it was prone to catastrophic failures as water froze in exposed sections of pipe, and the expansion of ice caused joints to fracture. Thorne had learned through careful observation and the intelligence provided by the agency that the estate's previous dvornik, an elderly man named Grigory, who had maintained the property for nearly 20 years, had died suddenly of a heart attack in early November, leaving the general temporarily without maintenance staff at the onset of winter. This was the window the operation required, a moment of practical necessity when the security concerns that would normally govern the hiring of new staff would be subordinated to the immediate need to keep the pipes from freezing and the buildings heated. Thorne had positioned himself in the nearby village, establishing a presence at the local tavern where he nursed cheap vodka and mentioned casually to anyone who would listen that he was looking for work, that he had experience with boilers and heating systems, that he was willing to work for minimal wages because his disability made it difficult to find employment. The opportunity presented itself during a particularly savage blizzard when the estate's heating system suffered a complete failure at 2 o'clock in the morning. The temperature in the main house had dropped rapidly, threatening not only the general's comfort, but potentially the integrity of the plumbing throughout the compound. The estate's security chief, A KGB captain named Volkov, the irony of the name was not lost on Thorne, had been dispatched to the village to find anyone with the skills to address the emergency. He had found Pavel Volkov in his rented room above the tavern, a shabby space that smelled of mildew and cabbage, and had offered him temporary employment to repair the system. Thorne had accepted with the humble eagerness of a man desperate for work, had gathered his tools, a collection of worn wrenches and hammers that looked like they had been inherited from a previous generation of mechanics, and had trudged through the storm to the estate. The repairs had taken 14 hours of continuous labor in conditions that would have defeated a less prepared man. The boiler itself, a massive Soviet-manufactured unit that bore the designation M58 and had been installed in 1957, had suffered a cascade failure when a frozen return line had caused pressure to build beyond safe parameters, blowing out several gaskets and fracturing a pipe fitting. Thorne had worked in the boiler room, a space barely large enough to accommodate both the equipment and a human body, in temperatures that hovered just above freezing. His hands had gone numb within the first hour, making it necessary to warm them periodically over the firebox to restore enough sensation to grip tools. He had crawled into spaces barely wide enough to accommodate his shoulders to reach failed components, his face pressed against metal so cold it burned exposed skin. He had improvised repairs using materials scavenged from the estate's storage rooms, demonstrating exactly the kind of resourceful competence that a genuine dvornik would possess, the ability to make obsolete equipment function through sheer mechanical intuition and determination. By mid-afternoon, he had restored heat to the main house, and by evening, the entire system was operational again. General Molotov, impressed by what he perceived as loyal dedication to duty during a crisis, had offered him permanent employment on the spot. The security screening that followed was cursory. The KGB captain had confirmed that Pavel Volkov's papers were in order, had interviewed him briefly and found him to be exactly what he appeared, a simple, partially disabled man grateful for steady work, and had concluded that no foreign intelligence service would be foolish enough to place an agent in a position that offered no access to classified materials and required brutal physical labor. The position was beneath suspicion because it was beneath ambition. Thus began Thorne's 12-year tenure as the invisible man of Zavidovo, the gatekeeper whose existence was defined by the intersection of extreme physical hardship and extraordinary intelligence access, a paradox that would slowly destroy both his body and his sense of self, while providing the American intelligence community with some of the most valuable insights into Soviet nuclear strategy that it would obtain during the entire Cold War. The rhythm of Thorne's daily existence was established within the first weeks and varied little over the subsequent years, a Sisyphean cycle of labor that began before dawn and extended well into the evening. He woke each morning in the gatehouse that adjoined the boiler room, a space approximately 4 meters by 5 meters that contained a narrow iron bed, a small table, a single chair, and a wood-burning stove that provided supplemental heat but was never quite adequate to overcome the cold that seeped through the walls. The structure had been built as an afterthought, its construction quality far inferior to the main buildings, and it possessed a quality of permanent dampness that no amount of heating could eliminate. The walls were bare plaster over brick, and they sweated condensation that froze into intricate patterns of ice during the coldest months, transforming the interior into something resembling a cave of frost. His first task each morning was to tend the central boiler, a beast of cast iron and steel that he came to think of privately as the Iron Beast, a machine that possessed an almost malevolent personality in its demands and unpredictability. The boiler required feeding every 4 to 6 hours depending on the outside temperature and the compound's heating load, a process that began with the removal of ash from the previous day's burn, a task that filled the boiler room with clouds of fine gray dust that coated every surface and infiltrated every fold of clothing. He shoveled the ash into metal buckets and carried them outside to a pit behind the gatehouse where years of accumulated residue had created a gray mountain that steamed faintly even in the coldest weather. The ash disposal was essential because excessive buildup restricted airflow and reduced the boiler's efficiency, But it was also among the most unpleasant aspects of the work, as the ash contained corrosive compounds that irritated the skin and lungs, leaving him with a persistent cough that worsened each winter and never entirely disappeared even during the brief summers. With the ash removed, he loaded fresh coal into the firebox, using a technique he had perfected over months of trial and error to create a fuel bed that would burn steadily for maximum duration. The coal itself was delivered monthly by truck, dumped in a large pile adjacent to the boiler room, and it was of variable quality, sometimes containing rocks and frozen mud that needed to be sorted out. He had learned to identify the best pieces by sight and touch, selecting chunks that were relatively pure carbon and arranging them in the firebox according to a specific geometry that optimized airflow. The process was surprisingly intellectually engaging, a puzzle that involved thermodynamics and chemistry, and Thorne found himself applying principles he had learned years ago in a different life, though he was careful never to let his problem-solving approach appear too sophisticated should anyone observe him working. Beyond the boiler, the estate generated an endless stream of maintenance demands that kept him occupied throughout the daylight hours and often into the night. The compound included 8 separate buildings, each with its own heating and plumbing systems that required constant attention. Pipes froze with stubborn regularity despite the circulation of hot water, usually in sections that ran through unheated spaces or along exterior walls where insulation was inadequate. Thawing frozen pipes became one of his primary skills, a delicate operation that required heating the frozen section gradually to prevent the pipe from shattering. He developed techniques using heated stones wrapped in cloth or carefully directed flames from a kerosene torch, working in cramped spaces beneath floors or in wall cavities where the pipes ran, his body contorted into positions that left him aching for hours afterward. The wood supply was another constant demand, as every building had at least one fireplace or wood-burning stove, and the general's preference was for birch, which burned hot and clean with a pleasant aroma. Maintaining an adequate supply required Thorne to spend several hours each day during autumn and winter chopping wood in a yard behind the gatehouse where logs were delivered and stacked. The physical labor of splitting birch with a heavy axe was punishing, a full-body effort that engaged every major muscle group and left him exhausted and drenched in sweat even in sub-zero temperatures. The repetitive impact of the axe striking wood transmitted shock waves through his shoulders and spine, and over the years he developed chronic pain in his lower back and a numbness in his hands that he attributed to nerve damage. But the wood chopping also served an intelligence function. It was during these sessions in the open yard that he occasionally observed the arrival of vehicles at the main house, noting license plates and the rank insignia of military officers, details he committed to memory for later transmission. The espionage component of Thorne's mission was paradoxically facilitated by the very ordinariness of his duties. He gathered intelligence not through risky clandestine activities, but through simple proximity, by being present in the margins of important conversations while performing the mundane tasks that his role required. The general's study was heated by a large fireplace that required attention several times each day, and it was Thorne's responsibility to maintain the fire, to replenish the wood supply, and to remove ashes. These tasks could not be postponed when the general was hosting visitors. A dying fire was a source of immediate discomfort that had to be addressed, and so Pavel Volkov would enter the study with an armload of birch logs, moving with his characteristic limp and stooped posture, his face expressing the blank deference of a simple man who knew his place. And he would kneel before the hearth and tend the fire while behind him men discussed missile throw weights and first strike scenarios and the vulnerability of American early warning systems. The psychological discipline required to maintain his cover during these moments was extraordinary. Thorne would work slowly, deliberately, making the task of arranging logs and adjusting the flue take as long as plausibly possible, but never so long that his presence became noteworthy. He kept his eyes downcast, focused on the fire, but his hearing was acute, and he possessed a trained memory that allowed him to retain technical details and proper names and fragments of conversation that would later be assembled into coherent intelligence reports. He had learned to breathe shallowly to minimize any sound that might remind the room's occupants of his presence, to move with a careful quietness that made him forgettable, and to exit with the same humble efficiency that had characterized his entrance. The most valuable intelligence came not from these direct observations, but from a more subtle form of access that developed over years as Thorne became a fixture of the estate, a presence so naturalized that the normal security consciousness was gradually relaxed. The general's grandchildren, 2 boys and a girl who visited frequently during summer holidays and occasionally during winter breaks, had adopted Pavel Volkov as a source of minor fascination and entertainment. They called him Uncle Pavel and would sometimes watch him work, asking simple questions about the boiler or the wood chopping, and Thorne played the role perfectly, responding with the kind of patient, slightly slow explanations that a good-natured simpleton might offer to curious children. The general, observing these interactions, seemed to interpret them as evidence of Pavel's harmlessness, and over time, Thorne found himself granted increasing freedom to move through the compound, to enter buildings to perform repairs without the constant supervision that had characterized his first months. It was during these unsupervised moments that Thorne occasionally found opportunities to observe documents left on desks or tables, though he was always careful to limit his exposure to such materials. The risk of being caught examining papers was too great, and even a moment of suspicious behavior could unravel the entire operation. Instead, he relied primarily on auditory intelligence, on conversations overheard while tending fires or repairing radiators, and on the gradual accumulation of contextual information that allowed him to infer larger patterns from fragmentary observations. He learned the names of the generals who visited most frequently, learned to recognize their voices and their particular areas of responsibility within the Soviet military hierarchy. He learned the rhythms of the estate's activities, could anticipate when important meetings were likely to occur based on preparation activities and the heightened alertness of the security staff. The transmission of intelligence to his handlers presented unique challenges given the isolation of his position and the constant, if passive, surveillance that characterized life in the Soviet Union. Traditional methods of communication were largely unavailable to him. He could not risk traveling to Moscow for brush passes or dead drops, could not access secure communication equipment, and could not maintain contact with other CIA assets without compromising both himself and them. Instead, the operation relied on a remarkably low-tech system that exploited one of the few activities that would not arouse suspicion: his woodcutting. The forest surrounding the estate extended for several kilometers in all directions, dense stands of birch and pine that were managed as a source of timber and firewood. It was expected that Pavel would venture into the forest periodically to select and mark trees for cutting, and these excursions provided opportunities for communication. The agency had established a series of dead-drop locations deep in the forest, carefully selected spots where Thorne could deposit reports written in microscopic handwriting on cigarette paper that was then concealed inside specially prepared hollow birch logs. The logs themselves were part of the wood supply he brought back to the estate, indistinguishable from hundreds of other logs except for subtle markings that identified them to recovery teams who would pose as forestry workers or hunters accessing public land adjacent to the estate's boundaries. The system was painfully slow. Weeks or sometimes months would pass between his deposit of a report and any indication that it had been recovered, and he had no reliable way to receive instructions or feedback from his handlers. He lived in a state of profound operational isolation, making tactical decisions about what information to collect and when to take the minimal risks necessary to transmit it, operating on general strategic guidance he had received before deployment, but adapting constantly to circumstances that could not have been anticipated. The isolation was not merely operational but existential, and it became one of the most corrosive aspects of the mission, the slow erosion of certainty about whether his intelligence was reaching its destination, whether it was valuable, whether the immense personal sacrifice he was making served any meaningful purpose in the larger confrontation between superpowers. The physical toll of the work accumulated steadily, each year leaving its mark on his body in ways that were initially subtle but that compounded into serious deterioration. The constant inhalation of coal dust and wood smoke damaged his respiratory system, leading to chronic bronchitis that worsened each winter and left him wheezing and coughing, particularly in the mornings. The cold itself was a continuous assault, and despite his careful acclimatization during training, he suffered repeated bouts of frostbite in his extremities, losing sensation in several toes and developing a circulatory condition that left his hands and feet perpetually cold even in relatively mild weather. The repetitive physical labor created chronic injuries that never fully healed. His lower back developed severe degeneration in the lumbar vertebrae. His shoulders lost range of motion due to repeated strain injuries, and his knees deteriorated to the point where climbing stairs became genuinely painful. But it was the psychological deterioration that represented the most profound cost of the operation, a gradual erosion of identity that Thorne first noticed around the third year of his deployment, and that accelerated thereafter. The man he had been, Elias Thorne, CIA officer, educated, cultured, capable of sophisticated analysis and social interaction, began to feel increasingly like a fiction, a character from a novel he had once read rather than a lived identity. Meanwhile, Pavel Volkov, the simple dvornik, became more real with each passing day, his limitations and habits and perspectives slowly colonizing Thorne's consciousness. He found himself thinking in Russian not just when interacting with others, but in his private moments, his internal monologue shifting to the grammatically imperfect Russian of his cover identity. He stopped mentally translating what he heard. Instead, he understood directly in Russian, and when he occasionally tried to recall English phrases or American cultural references, they came with increasing difficulty, as if he were accessing memories from someone else's life. The monotony of his existence contributed to this dissolution of self. Each day was nearly identical to the one that preceded it. Wake before dawn, tend the boiler, chop wood, perform maintenance, eat simple meals of bread and porridge and occasionally cabbage soup, tend the boiler again, sleep. The estate operated on a seasonal rhythm, with more visitors during hunting season in autumn and during the winter holidays. But even these variations were minor, and the years began to blur together into an undifferentiated gray continuity. He marked time not by calendars but by the changing of seasons and by occasional distinctive events. The year the main boiler's firebox cracked and had to be replaced. The year a severe ice storm brought down power lines and left the estate running on generator power for 3 days. The year the general's oldest grandson graduated from university and brought his new wife to visit. His only consistent human interactions were superficial and transactional. Brief exchanges with the household staff who prepared meals for him. Occasional conversations with the security personnel who manned the estate's gatehouse, and his carefully maintained relationship with the general's grandchildren. He had no friends, no confidants, no one with whom he could speak honestly about anything of substance. He lived inside a performance so total that there was no backstage, no moment when he could step out of character and simply be himself, because the risk of relaxing his guard even for a moment was too great. The KGB's surveillance was not constant or intensive. The regime's resources were finite, and a dvornik at a dacha warranted only periodic attention. But it was unpredictable, and vigilance had to be maintained at all times. The loneliness was crushing, a weight that pressed down on him with particular intensity during the long winter evenings when darkness came early and the temperature in his small room dropped despite the wood stove's efforts. He would lie in his narrow bed, wrapped in coarse blankets, listening to the wind howl through gaps in the window frames, and he would think about his previous life with a strange detachment, as if remembering a film he had seen long ago. He had been engaged before the operation to a woman named Sarah who worked for the State Department, and they had discussed marriage and a future together. But those plans had been abandoned when he accepted the FROSTKEEPER assignment. She had been told that he was being posted to an extended deep cover operation, but given no details about location or duration, and after 2 years of silence, he assumed she had moved on with her life. He tried occasionally to remember her face clearly, but found the image fading, replaced by the more immediate and concrete reality of his current existence. The estate's rhythm changed significantly after 1977, when General Molotov's health began to decline and his activities became more limited. The frequency of high-level meetings decreased, and the compound saw fewer visitors, which meant reduced intelligence opportunities but also a certain relaxation of the operational pressure that had defined Thorne's first years. He had by this point transmitted dozens of reports covering a remarkable range of topics: detailed discussions about Soviet nuclear doctrine and first strike scenarios, debates about the efficacy of anti-ballistic missile systems, analyses of American strategic capabilities as understood by Soviet military intelligence, personnel conflicts within the strategic rocket forces, and technical details about specific missile systems that were being developed or deployed. The cumulative value of this intelligence was enormous, though Thorne himself had no way to assess its impact, could not know how his reports were being analyzed and disseminated within the American intelligence community, could not see how his observations were being integrated into national intelligence estimates and strategic planning documents that shaped American negotiating positions and defense investments. By 1981, Thorne had entered his 12th year in the operation, and both his body and his operational security were reaching critical limits. The respiratory damage from years of coal dust inhalation had progressed to the point where he experienced difficulty breathing during physical exertion, and he had developed a chronic cough that produced dark, blood-flecked phlegm. The cold that had once been merely uncomfortable had become genuinely dangerous to his compromised health. His immune system, weakened by inadequate nutrition and constant exposure to harsh conditions, was failing to fight off infections effectively. He suffered a severe bout of pneumonia during the winter of 1981-82, an illness that left him bedridden for 2 weeks, and so weakened that he struggled to perform even basic maintenance tasks for months afterward. It was during this period of vulnerability that the crisis that would end his operation developed. The general, who had observed Pavel's deteriorating condition with genuine concern, a concern that spoke to a paternalistic decency that complicated Thorne's ability to view him as simply an enemy, insisted that he receive proper medical attention. A military doctor was summoned to the estate to examine him, and the examination revealed the severity of his respiratory compromise. The doctor recommended immediate hospitalization, possibly at one of the military facilities that served the defense establishment's elite, where he could receive intensive treatment including antibiotics and respiratory therapy. The recommendation was made as an act of kindness, an expression of the general's gratitude for Pavel's years of loyal service, but it represented an existential threat to the operation because a thorough medical examination would almost certainly reveal anomalies that would trigger security investigations. The most immediately dangerous issue was Thorne's dental work, which included fillings and a crown that had been placed years earlier using materials and techniques that were distinctly American. Soviet dentistry, while competent in major cities, was generally less sophisticated, and the quality of his dental restorations would likely provoke questions from any observant physician. Similarly, his vaccination history would not match what would be expected for a Soviet citizen born in the 1930s. He carried antibodies for diseases that Soviet medical protocols would not have routinely vaccinated against during that era. Even his blood type, properly recorded in American military records but documented differently in his forged Soviet papers, could become a point of dangerous scrutiny if cross-checked carefully. Thorne understood that extraction had become necessary, and he needed to signal this urgency to his handlers without access to the emergency communication protocols that were available to CIA officers operating under more conventional covers. The solution required improvisation and risk, and it exploited one final aspect of his cover identity, his putative Orthodox faith. Pavel Volkov, in keeping with his background as a man from rural Russia, was nominally Orthodox Christian, and while religious practice was discouraged in the Soviet Union, it was tolerated for older citizens, particularly those of limited education and social status. Thorne had maintained this aspect of his cover carefully, wearing a simple cross on a chain beneath his shirt and occasionally mentioning the church in ways consistent with his character's presumed level of religiosity. He informed the general's household that before accepting hospitalization, he wished to receive the last rites from an Orthodox priest, a request that was understood as the superstitious desire of a simple man facing serious illness. The request was granted, and arrangements were made for a priest from a nearby parish to visit the estate. What neither the general nor his security staff knew was that this particular priest, Father Dmitri, was in fact a CIA asset, an actual Orthodox clergyman who had been recruited years earlier and who served as an emergency contact for exactly this kind of situation. The agency maintained a small network of such individuals, positioned throughout the Soviet Union, who could be activated for extraction operations when other methods were unavailable. The meeting with Father Dmitri took place in Thorne's small room in the gatehouse, with the door closed to provide privacy for what was ostensibly a sacramental ritual. The priest performed an abbreviated version of the last rites, speaking prayers in Old Church Slavonic while Thorne knelt beside his bed. And in the brief moments when their positions brought them close together, Thorne whispered the critical information, his identity, his need for immediate extraction, and the medical threat that had compromised his position. Father Dmitri betrayed no reaction, completing the ritual with proper solemnity before blessing Thorne and departing. But the message had been transmitted, and the machinery of extraction was now in motion. The extraction itself, executed 4 days later, was less dramatic than the spy novels might suggest, but no less dangerous for its apparent mundanity. A laundry service that had a contract to clean linens for several dachas in the region, and which was in fact a front operation maintained by the CIA, made its routine pickup at the estate. Thorne, still weak from pneumonia and operating under the pretense of making a visit to the village for minor supplies before his scheduled hospitalization, was smuggled out in the back of the laundry van, hidden among bags of soiled linens, breathing through his damaged lungs in the stifling space, while the van passed through the estate's security checkpoint with no more scrutiny than usual. The van drove to a distribution facility outside Kalinin, where he was transferred to a diplomatic vehicle with official plates that provided immunity from search. The drive to the American embassy in Moscow took 3 hours, and Thorne spent that time in the trunk of the vehicle, a space only marginally larger than a coffin, fighting waves of claustrophobia and coughing fits that he desperately tried to suppress. His debriefing began within hours of his arrival at the embassy, and continued for 3 weeks, conducted by teams of analysts who flew in from Langley to interview him. He provided thousands of pages of detailed reports, reconstruct conversations he had overheard years earlier, identified photographs of Soviet military personnel he had observed at the Dacha, and helped analysts understand the context and significance of fragmentary intelligence that the agency had collected from other sources. His contribution to American understanding of Soviet nuclear strategy was assessed as among the most significant of the decade, providing insights that would inform American negotiating positions at arms control talks and strategic planning for years to come. He had accomplished what FROSTKEEPER had been designed to accomplish, had proved that an agent positioned in apparent irrelevance could provide intelligence of extraordinary value, and he had survived 12 years in deep cover without compromise. But survival, he discovered, was not the same as return. The agency arranged his repatriation to the United States with the same care they had invested in his infiltration, establishing a new identity for him, and providing financial compensation that reflected both his years of service and the severity of the physical damage he had sustained. He was relocated to a small town in the Pacific Northwest, chosen for its similarity in climate to the region where he had spent 12 years, and provided with a modest house and a pension that would support him comfortably for the remainder of his life. The agency's psychologists worked with him intensively, attempting to facilitate his psychological reintegration and address what they diagnosed as severe trauma and possible dissociative identity disorder stemming from his prolonged immersion in his cover identity. The reintegration largely failed. Thorne found himself unable to adapt to American life, to the warmth and comfort and abundance that had once been his normal experience. He kept his house cold, maintaining interior temperatures barely above freezing despite the concern of neighbors and the protests of the agency-provided therapists who visited him. He chopped his own wood, installing a wood-burning stove and spending hours each day splitting logs in his backyard with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized Pavel Volkov's work. He spoke rarely and then usually in Russian, even when his interlocutors spoke only English, and he seemed most comfortable when performing manual labor, when his hands were occupied with tasks that required no complex thought or social interaction. He struggled to remember his life before FROSTKEEPER, before Pavel Volkov, and he sometimes introduced himself with his cover name before catching himself and correcting the error. The psychological boundaries between his original identity and his cover identity had broken down so thoroughly that both felt partially real and partially fictional, and he existed in a kind of liminal space between them, never entirely one or the other. He avoided social interaction, declined invitations from the few neighbors who attempted to befriend him, and spent his days in solitary routine that approximated the life he had lived in Zavidovo, waking early, tending his fire, chopping wood, performing maintenance on his house with obsessive attention to detail. The respiratory damage he had sustained never healed. If anything, it worsened in the years following his return, progressing from chronic bronchitis to emphysema that severely limited his physical capacity. He was prescribed medications and oxygen therapy, but he was inconsistent in following medical advice, as if some part of him remained in character as Pavel Volkov, a simple man who would distrust sophisticated medical interventions and prefer to endure suffering with stoic acceptance. He continued to smoke, a habit he had adopted as part of his cover, rolling his own cigarettes with cheap tobacco in the Russian style, and the habit accelerated his decline. Elias Thorne died in February of 1995, alone in his small house during a winter storm, found several days later by a postal worker who noticed accumulated mail and alerted authorities. The official cause of death was respiratory failure secondary to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but a more complete autopsy would have revealed a constellation of injuries and conditions that told the story of his 12 years in deep cover, the deteriorated state of his spine and joints, the scar tissue in his lungs from years of inhaling coal dust and wood smoke, the nerve damage in his extremities from repeated frostbite, the evidence of malnutrition and chronic stress. He was 60 years old at his death, though his body suggested someone much older, aged prematurely by conditions that no American of his generation should have endured. His obituary, placed by the agency in a local newspaper, identified him as a retired government employee and mentioned no specifics about his service. His funeral was attended by 3 people: a CIA officer who had worked on his debriefing, a therapist who had tried unsuccessfully to help him reintegrate, and Father Dmitri, who had immigrated to the United States after the Soviet Union's collapse, and who alone understood the full scope of what Thorne had sacrificed. They buried him in a small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town, and the agency placed a simple headstone that bore his real name and the years of his birth and death, with no mention of his service or his extraordinary contribution to American security during one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The irony that defined Thorne's life and death was never lost on those few who knew his full story. He had spent 12 years keeping the Soviet enemy warm, tending the fires and maintaining the heating systems that provided comfort to men who planned the potential destruction of American cities, and in doing so, he had helped keep America safe. He had gathered the intelligence that allowed American leaders to negotiate from informed positions, to understand Soviet capabilities and intentions with a clarity that reduced the risk of miscalculation and catastrophic war. He had lived in absolute cold to prevent the Cold War from becoming a hot one, and he had paid for that service with his health, his identity, and ultimately his capacity to rejoin the world he had protected. The Moscow archives, opened decades after the Cold War's end, contain no record of Pavel Ivanovich Volkov, dvornik of the Molotov Dacha in Zavidovo from 1969 to 1982. The KGB files on General Molotov make no mention of security concerns regarding his household staff during that period. The history that Thorne helped write has no chapter that bears his name, no acknowledgement of the role he played in the grand confrontation between superpowers. He existed in the margins of history, invisible by design, and he remained invisible even in memory, known fully only to the small number of intelligence professionals who read his file and marveled at both the audacity of FROSTKEEPER and the terrible price it extracted from the man who made it succeed. He was the gatekeeper who kept the gates of war closed, and he did so by becoming someone else so completely that he could never entirely return to being himself, a sacrifice more profound than death, because it was a kind of death extended over decades, the slow erasure of identity in service of a cause that could never publicly be acknowledged.